On the first day of February 1968, two of the greatest railroad companies in American history signed a piece of paper and became one: the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central. Rivals for more than a century, competitors for the most profitable rail corridors in the eastern United States, they merged into a single entity called the Penn Central Transportation Company. It was the largest corporate merger in American history to that point. The men who organized it called it a bold stroke, a necessary adaptation, a way of combining two great systems into something even more powerful. 29 months later, Penn Central filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. The Pennsylvania Railroad had operated for 120 years. At its peak, it was the largest corporation on earth, not the largest railroad, not the largest transportation company, the largest corporation of any kind, in any industry, anywhere in the world. It employed more than 200,000 people. It ran more than 10,000 miles of its own track, with controlled subsidiaries stretching its reach across a dozen states. Its freight trains moved the coal that heated American homes, the steel that built American cities, the grain that fed American families. Its passenger trains defined what luxury travel meant to a generation of Americans. And within 2 years, the Pennsylvania Railroad as an institution had ceased to exist. This documentary is the story of how that happened. But to understand the collapse, you have to understand the empire, where it came from, what it built, what it carried, and what made it the most powerful private institution in the history of American transportation. How did the Pennsylvania Railroad rise to become the industrial engine of a continent? And how did a railroad that had survived the Civil War, 2 world depressions, and 2 world wars finally come undone, not by a single catastrophe, but by a slow accumulation of forces that its leadership could see clearly and could not stop? That is the question this documentary will answer. Stand at the foot of the Allegheny Mountains in central Pennsylvania and look west. The ridgelines rise and fall in long parallel waves, one after another, running from northeast to southwest as far as the eye can see. There is no natural pass through these mountains. No river cuts cleanly from one side to the other. For the first half of the 19th century, that geographic fact was the single greatest obstacle to American commerce. Everything that needed to move between the eastern seaboard and the interior of the continent had to go over, around, or through those mountains. The Pennsylvania Railroad was built to solve that problem. In the hills just east of Pittsburgh, in the city of Altoona, the Pennsylvania Railroad built the largest railroad repair and maintenance complex in the world. At its peak, Altoona employed 17,000 people in a single facility: machinists, boilermakers, ironworkers, carpenters, electricians, all of them devoted to keeping the Pennsylvania Railroad's fleet of locomotives and freight cars in service. Altoona was not a city that had a railroad in it. It was a city that the railroad had built, for the railroad's own purposes, from the ground up. The distinction matters. The Pennsylvania Railroad did not merely pass through the landscapes of Pennsylvania and the industrial Northeast. It created them. The Pennsylvania Railroad was not simply a transportation company. In its fullest expression, it was an industrial network, a system for moving raw materials from the ground to the mill, finished goods from the mill to the market, and people from one end of the American economy to the other. Coal, steel, coke, iron ore, grain, manufactured goods, passengers in Pullman cars, all of it moving on Pennsylvania Railroad track, in Pennsylvania Railroad cars, pulled by Pennsylvania Railroad locomotives over Pennsylvania, railroad-owned bridges, and through Pennsylvania Railroad Board tunnels. The system was so thoroughly integrated into American industrial life that when it faltered, industries across the eastern United States faltered with it. By the early years of the 20th century, the Pennsylvania Railroad had grown into the largest corporation in the world. Its revenues rivaled the budgets of small European nations. In the final decades of the 19th century, its bonded debt exceeded the national debt of the United States itself. Its shareholders included banks, universities, insurance companies, and individual investors from Boston to San Francisco. In the financial markets of New York and London, the Pennsylvania Railroad was considered the gold standard of American industrial investment, the standard railroad of the world. As its own promotional materials proclaimed, without embarrassment. Yet within 2 generations, this enormous railroad empire would begin to unravel. The forces that destroyed it were already present at its peak. Structural tensions the railroad's own leadership recognized, worried over, wrote memoranda about, and could not ultimately resolve. Understanding those tensions requires understanding, first, how the empire was built. The Pennsylvania Railroad was chartered by the state of Pennsylvania in 1846. The men who organized it were not dreamers. They were merchants and bankers in Philadelphia who had watched, with gathering alarm, as the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad pushed west from Baltimore toward the Ohio River. If the B&O reached the Ohio Valley first, Baltimore would capture the freight trade of the American interior. Philadelphia, the largest city in the country a generation earlier, would be left behind. The Pennsylvania Railroad's founding purpose was defensive. Protect Philadelphia's commercial position by building a faster, more direct route to Pittsburgh and the Ohio River. The city of Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania provided much of the initial capital. The first president of the railroad was a man named Samuel Merrick, a businessman, not a railroad engineer. He understood what the railroad needed to become before anyone had figured out how to build it. The route west from Philadelphia passed through Lancaster and across the Susquehanna River, climbed into the ridges of the Appalachian Plateau, reached Altoona, and then confronted the Allegheny Front, a wall of mountain rising 1,400 feet in less than 5 miles. No steam locomotive in the world in 1847 could climb that grade. The solution devised by the railroad's chief engineer, John Edgar Thompson, was the horseshoe curve, a sweeping bend in the mountain above Altoona that used the topography of the hillside to create a more gradual grade, stretching the steepest climb across a longer distance. The curve opened in 1854 and immediately became one of the most celebrated feats of engineering in American history. Thompson understood that a railroad was not just track and locomotives, it was a managed system. Schedules, signals, grades, bridges, yards, and maintenance facilities, all of which had to function together to move freight and passengers reliably. He brought to the Pennsylvania Railroad a discipline of operations and a rigor of engineering that shaped the institution long after his death. When Thompson became president of the railroad in 1852, he began the systematic expansion that would carry the PRR beyond Pennsylvania, into Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and eventually to Chicago. The route to Chicago was the decisive move. By the mid-1860s, the Pennsylvania Railroad had achieved what its founders had set out to prevent, not just parity with the Baltimore and Ohio, clear superiority. The direct line from New York to Chicago, running through Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, and Fort Wayne, Indiana, became the most commercially productive railroad corridor in the world. The freight it carried was not merely profitable. It was structurally important to the American economy in a way that gave the Pennsylvania Railroad a kind of power that no private corporation had ever possessed. The railroad's growth attracted capital, which funded further expansion, which attracted more capital. By 1870, the Pennsylvania Railroad had extended its reach into New Jersey, arriving at the Hudson River opposite New York City. By 1880, it controlled subsidiary railroads across the mid-Atlantic states. By 1900, it had become, in the words of one financial historian, less a corporation than a quasi-governmental institution. Too large to be allowed to fail, too complex to be fully understood even by its own management, and too essential to American commerce for any political authority to challenge seriously. The standard railroad of the world. In the early years of the 20th century, it was, on most measures by which such things could be judged, an accurate description. The Civil War tested every railroad in the eastern United States, and the Pennsylvania Railroad emerged from the test larger, richer, and more indispensable than it had entered. In the first days of the conflict, when the roads and bridges of Maryland were destroyed by Confederate sympathizers, cutting the connection between Washington and the northern states, The Pennsylvania Railroad provided the only viable route for Union troops moving south. President Lincoln's Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, a Pennsylvania political figure with deep ties to the state's railroad interests, understood this clearly. The federal government poured contracts and capital into the railroad system it depended upon. The Pennsylvania Railroad carried troops, artillery, horses, ammunition, medical supplies, and the administrative machinery of a war being fought on an industrial scale for the first time in human history. What the railroad learned during the Civil War was never forgotten. The logistics of moving massive quantities of freight over long distances with strict timing requirements. This was not civilian commerce dressed in military clothing. It was a fundamentally different discipline, and the Pennsylvania Railroad absorbed it completely. The block train, the systematic rotation of rolling stock across a continent-spanning network, the discipline of industrial-scale logistics under time pressure. The Civil War compressed decades of operational learning into 4 years. After the war, the railroad's growth accelerated. The steel industry, centered in Pittsburgh, became the railroad's single most important customer, and the railroad became the steel industry's indispensable partner. Iron ore arrived by ship at Erie, Pennsylvania, on Lake Erie. It was transferred to gondola cars on PRR track and moved south and east to the blast furnaces and open hearth mills of the Pittsburgh district. Finished steel moved back out on the same tracks to the cities and construction sites of the eastern seaboard. The relationship was not a business arrangement between equals. The Pennsylvania Railroad and the Pittsburgh steel industry were locked together in a mutual dependency that shaped both of them for the next 70 years. The railroad's relationship to the coal industry was equally fundamental. The bituminous coal fields of western Pennsylvania, the fuel for Pittsburgh's furnaces, moved entirely by rail. The anthracite fields of the Lehigh Valley, farther east, moved through a network of connecting railroads that the PRR either owned or controlled. By 1900, the railroad was not simply transporting the industrial economy of the American Northeast. It was the circulatory system through which that economy's lifeblood moved. No single competitor threatened this position seriously. The New York Central ran parallel to the PRR across much of its territory. The competition between them was real and sustained, in freight rates, in passenger service quality, in executive prestige. But the competition was managed. The two roads divided territories, respected rate agreements, and avoided the kind of destructive rate wars that had ruined weaker lines. The Pennsylvania Railroad's management was conservative, patient, and deeply suspicious of any arrangement that might destabilize the system it had spent 60 years building. That instinct toward stability would serve the railroad well for another half-century, and then it would prove fatal. The single greatest engineering achievement of the Pennsylvania Railroad's history was not the horseshoe curve. The curve was a triumph of geographic intelligence, using the shape of the land to solve a problem the land had created. The achievement that defined the modern Pennsylvania Railroad was something more audacious, tunneling under the Hudson River and bringing the railroad directly into the heart of Manhattan. For the first 5 decades of its existence, the Pennsylvania Railroad terminated at the Hudson River. Passengers crossed by ferry. Freight was transferred to barges or floated across on car floats, specially designed barges that could carry a full-loaded freight car. The arrangement worked, but it was slow, weather-dependent, expensive, and operationally fragile. Every major storm on the Hudson disrupted service. Every ferry crossing added time and cost that the railroad's competition did not always share. The decision to tunnel under the Hudson River was made in the early years of the 20th century by Alexander Cassatt, the railroad's president and one of the most technically ambitious executives the industry had ever produced. The project required drilling twin tubes under the Hudson River, running them through the bedrock of Manhattan to a new terminal at 33rd Street, and then continuing the tunnels further east, under the East River, and out to Long Island. It was the largest urban construction project in American history. Cassatt died in December of 1906, 4 years before the station he had conceived opened its doors. He never walked through the concourse he had imagined, The station that rose above those tunnels, Pennsylvania Station, opened in 1910, was not merely a railroad terminal. It was a statement about what kind of institution the Pennsylvania Railroad believed itself to be. The main waiting room was modeled after the Roman baths of Caracalla. The concourse was covered by an iron and glass ceiling that flooded the interior with natural light. The station occupied 2 full city blocks, encompassed 21 tracks on 2 levels, and handled tens of thousands of passengers every day. It was, in the judgment of virtually every architectural historian who has studied it, one of the most magnificent public spaces ever built in the United States. The electrification of the main line followed from the same logic. Underground terminals required electric traction. Steam locomotives could not operate in enclosed tunnels without asphyxiating everyone inside. But once the infrastructure for electric operation was built into the tunnels in the terminal, the case for extending electrification outward along the main line became compelling. By the 1930s, the Pennsylvania Railroad had electrified its entire main line from New York to Washington and from New York through Philadelphia to Harrisburg. More than 600 miles of overhead catenary wire. More electrified mainline track than any railroad in the Western Hemisphere. The GG1 electric locomotive, introduced in 1934, became the symbol of this electrified system. A streamlined 80-foot machine rated at nearly 5,000 horsepower, capable of pulling a heavy passenger train at 100 miles per hour. Among the most powerful passenger locomotives ever built, a machine that defined what electrified railroading could achieve, and it was a Pennsylvania Railroad locomotive. The 2 decades between 1935 and 1955 represented the Pennsylvania Railroad at its most complete expression. The freight network ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. Conway Yard, built on the Ohio River in western Pennsylvania, was the most technologically sophisticated freight classification facility in the world. Its hump system, in which strings of freight cars were pushed over a gentle crest and allowed to roll by gravity down into their designated tracks, their speed controlled by automatic retarders, could classify thousands of cars every day. The control tower that managed Conway Yard's operations in the 1950s looked more like a military command center than anything previously associated with railroading. Punch card tabulation systems tracked every car in the network. Telephone and teletype circuits coordinated movement across the entire eastern system. The railroad knew, at any given moment, where its freight was. The passenger service was equally formidable. The Broadway Limited, the Pennsylvania Railroad's flagship overnight train between New York and Chicago, competed directly with the New York Central's 20th Century Limited for the business and social elite who needed to travel between the 2 great cities. Both trains offered private sleeping rooms, dining cars serving 4-course meals prepared to order, barbers, valets, secretarial services. The Broadway Limited left New York's Penn Station every evening and arrived at Chicago Union Station the following morning. The schedule was maintained with a precision that the railroad's operating department treated as a matter of institutional honor. The railroad's workforce was enormous and deeply organized. The major railway brotherhoods, the engineers, the firemen, the conductors, the trainmen, had negotiated labor agreements with the Pennsylvania Railroad going back to the 1880s. The relationship was not always peaceful. Strikes punctuated the railroad's history from its earliest decades, but it was structured. The Pennsylvania Railroad knew its labor force, and its labor force knew the railroad. In the railroad towns strung along the main line, Harrisburg, Altoona, Pittsburgh, Connellsville, and dozens of smaller communities, the PRR was not merely the largest employer. It was the organizing institution of community life. A man who hired on as a machinist at Altoona in 1920 could reasonably expect to work for the railroad and then see his son work for the railroad, and perhaps his grandson after that. 1948, the year the railroad made its film portrait on the track for the Association of American Railroads, was close to the high water mark of the entire system. American industrial output was at a post-war peak. The freight trains were full. The passenger trains were crowded. The ledger books showed profits. and underneath those profits, almost invisible, were the first faint signs that the world the Pennsylvania Railroad had been built to serve was beginning to change. The empire was at its height. What neither its shareholders nor its admirers fully grasped was that the forces gathering against it were not the kind that could be resisted by building more track. In 1954, a film was made for the Westinghouse Air Brake Company, a company whose entire business depended on the health of American railroading. The film was called At This Moment. It gathered a group of railroad workers in a diner to discuss the importance of their industry. It is a cheerful film, professionally produced, and behind its cheerfulness there is an audible anxiety. The anxiety had a name: the interstate highway system. Railroads in the United States had always operated on private capital. The companies built the track, bought the rights of way, maintained the roadbed, and paid taxes on every mile of it. When a railroad needed a new line, it raised the money from investors, issued bonds, and paid for the construction itself. This had been the arrangement since the earliest days of American railroading, and the Pennsylvania Railroad had built one of the most sophisticated systems in the world under its terms. It is worth noting that railroads had not always operated without public support. In their own formative era, American railroads received enormous federal land grants, government-backed financing, and favorable regulatory treatment. The Pennsylvania Railroad itself benefited from state capital in its early years. The railroads were not wrong to note the unequal subsidy, but they were selectively historical in how they described it. The automobile and trucking industries operated under terms that were different in a critical way. The roads they used were built with public money, state and local funds, and eventually, beginning in 1956 with the passage of the Federal Aid Highway Act, federal money on an unprecedented scale. The interstate highway system authorized 41,000 miles of high-speed, limited-access roads connecting every major American city. The federal government paid 90% of the cost. Trucking companies paid a fuel tax that contributed to the highway fund, but that contribution covered only a fraction of the true cost of building and maintaining the system. The rest was a subsidy. Invisible, politically popular, and structurally ruinous to the railroads that competed with the trucks that used those roads. The Pennsylvania Railroad's management understood this clearly. In boardroom presentations and public testimony before Congress, PRR executives made the same argument repeatedly. The railroad is being asked to compete with an industry that uses publicly funded infrastructure, while the railroad pays for its own. The argument was economically correct. It was also politically powerless. The post-war American consensus on the automobile was so broad and so deep that no transportation policy could survive which appeared to constrain it. The Pennsylvania Turnpike had already offered an early demonstration of what a high-quality limited-access highway would do to railroad freight. Opened in 1940, connecting Pittsburgh east to the Susquehanna Valley, the first section of what would eventually become a highway stretching all the way to Philadelphia, the Turnpike gave truckers a route faster than any they had previously managed. By the mid-1940s, truck freight across Pennsylvania had increased sharply. The railroad's less-than-carload freight, the mixed small shipment business that had once filled boxcars with furniture, appliances, dry goods, and manufactured items, began to erode. Trucks offered door-to-door delivery. The railroad could only offer terminal-to-terminal. The customer who once shipped 100 boxes of hardware from a factory in Allentown to a warehouse in Pittsburgh increasingly found it more convenient to put those boxes on a truck. The railroad fought back with innovation. Piggyback service, loading highway trailers directly onto flat cars so that the truck's trailer made the long-haul journey by rail while the truck itself handled local pickup and delivery, was introduced in the early 1950s as a way of capturing the door-to-door freight that was migrating to the highways. Conway Yard added facilities to handle trailers. The railroad's promotional films of the period show piggyback service with undisguised enthusiasm, as if the railroad had found a way to co-opt the competition. Piggyback helped. It was not enough. The fundamental problem was not that the railroad was failing to adapt. It was that the economic playing field was tilted in a direction that no amount of adaptation could fully correct. Every dollar of federal money that went into the interstate system was a dollar that made truck freight more competitive relative to rail. The railroad could not build its own competing highway. It could only watch the ground shift beneath its tracks. As the 1950s drew toward a close, the Pennsylvania Railroad was still profitable, still operating, still carrying freight across 14 states, but the revenue base on which all of that depended was beginning to thin. The airplane killed the long-distance passenger train. That sentence appears obvious in retrospect. It was not obvious in 1948, and it was not even fully apparent in 1955. The transition from rail to air travel happened gradually. Then, suddenly. In the way that many structural shifts in transportation history occur, invisible until the numbers make it undeniable. But airlines were not the only competition the passenger trains faced. On the medium-distance routes, Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, New York to Cleveland, Harrisburg to Chicago, the private automobile was equally destructive. A family that might once have booked 4 tickets on a Pennsylvania Railroad train could now load the car and drive an interstate highway. No schedule, no porter, no dining car, but complete flexibility and no fare. Airlines dominated the long routes. Cars dominated the medium routes. Between them, they left the railroad's passenger business with no defensible territory. The Pennsylvania Railroad had always been as much a passenger carrier as a freight railroad. Penn Station alone handled more than 100 million passengers in the years immediately following the Second World War. The overnight trains to Chicago, the Broadway Limited, the Liberty Limited, the General, were filled with businessmen, government officials, entertainers, and ordinary travelers who had no other practical option for the journey. The sleeping car, the dining car, the club car. These were not luxuries available only to the wealthy. The railroad offered a range of accommodations, from the roomette for solo travelers to the full drawing room for those who needed more space. A ticket on the Broadway Limited was an affordable choice for a traveling salesman, as well as an attainable splurge for a family making a special trip. The Douglas DC-6, the Lockheed Constellation, and eventually the Boeing 707 changed that calculus permanently. The piston-engine airliners of the late 1940s reduced the New York to Chicago journey from 16 hours to about 4. The jet airliners of the late 1950s reduced it further. The airplane did not merely compete with the overnight train. It made the overnight train seem, to a new generation of travelers, like an antiquated way to spend time. The railroads responded with their own innovations. The Vistadome car, introduced in the early 1950s, offered passengers a glass-covered observation deck rising above the roofline of the train, a spectacular way to watch the American landscape moving past at 80 miles per hour. The Pennsylvania Railroad experimented with lightweight equipment. The experimental Pioneer 3 car, built in collaboration with the Budd Company, used aircraft-style construction techniques to reduce the weight of passenger cars without sacrificing strength. The railroad also tested the General Motors Aerotrain, a low-slung, streamlined train set that looked, to 1950s eyes, unmistakably modern. The Aerotrain was a technical failure. Its ride quality was rough, its diesel engines unreliable, and its operating costs higher than anticipated. The Pennsylvania Railroad quietly withdrew it from service. But the episode illustrated a larger problem. The railroad was investing heavily in passenger service improvements at precisely the moment when the economics of passenger rail were turning permanently negative. Passenger trains cost money to run regardless of how many passengers are on them. A train staffed with engineers, firemen, conductors, porters, dining car workers, and sleeping car attendants generates the same labor costs whether it is fully occupied or running half empty. As airline ridership grew and rail ridership declined, the trains ran with fewer passengers paying fares against the same fixed costs of operation. The passenger deficit, the gap between what the trains cost to run and what the passengers paid to ride them, widened every year through the 1950s and into the 1960s. In 1967, the same year Penn Central merger negotiations were entering their final stage, the Pennsylvania Railroad discontinued the Broadway Limited's all-Pullman service and merged it with a coach train. The red carpet at Penn Station, which had been rolled out at departure for decades, was quietly put away. The Pennsylvania Railroad's response was to reduce service, consolidate trains, drop frequency, combine routes that had once been operated separately. Each reduction made the remaining service slightly less attractive to the passengers who still preferred to travel by rail, which accelerated the decline of the ridership that justified running the remaining trains. The spiral was self-reinforcing and nearly impossible to escape. The loss of the passenger business was not merely a revenue problem. The passenger trains had served a function in the railroad's operational culture that went beyond their financial contribution. They were the public face of the institution, the service that ordinary Americans experienced directly. When a family chose to travel from Philadelphia to Chicago on the Broadway Limited, they were not just buying transportation. They were experiencing what the Pennsylvania Railroad had made of itself over a century of investment and aspiration. The gradual disappearance of that service was, in a way that the freight business never could be, a visible measure of institutional decline. The Pennsylvania Railroad was losing its passengers to the sky and its freight to the highway. What remained was an enormous physical infrastructure, thousands of miles of track, hundreds of terminals and yards, thousands of locomotives and cars, all of which required constant maintenance and capital investment, regardless of how much traffic was moving over it. A railroad cannot reduce its physical plant in proportion to its traffic the way a trucking company can reduce its fleet. If a trucking company loses business, it parks trucks. The capital tied up in the idle truck stops depreciating. The operating costs stop accumulating. If a railroad loses business, it cannot simply park the track. The track remains. It still needs to be maintained. Ties rot, rails crack, ballast shifts, bridges settle. The physical degradation of railroad infrastructure is continuous, regardless of how many trains are running over it. The Pennsylvania Railroad owned the most extensive electrified railroad infrastructure in North America. The overhead catenary system, the wire, the poles, the substations, the power distribution network required continuous maintenance. The tunnels under the Hudson and East Rivers required continuous inspection and upkeep. The bridges over the Susquehanna, the Delaware, and dozens of smaller waterways required periodic rehabilitation. Penn Station itself, with its 40 acres of floor space and its complex mechanical systems, demanded a maintenance budget that would have strained the resources of a major city government. Through the 1950s, the railroad had maintained this infrastructure through internal cash flow. The freight revenues and passenger revenues that came in were sufficient to cover operating costs, service the debt, and fund capital improvements. As those revenues declined, the railroad faced an impossible arithmetic. The income was falling faster than the physical plant could be reduced. Deferred maintenance began to accumulate. Deferred maintenance on a railroad is different from deferred maintenance on a building. A building with a leaking roof loses space to water damage. A railroad with deteriorating track loses the ability to run trains at full speed over that track. Speed restrictions, the railroad's term for sections of track where trains must slow below normal operating pace, spread through the system. A freight train running at 30 miles per hour over a restricted section instead of 60 costs twice as much per ton-mile to operate. The productivity of the railroad's physical plant declines. Operating costs rise relative to revenue. The deficit widens. The railroad's management was not blind to this dynamic. The internal documents and public statements of Pennsylvania Railroad executives in the 1950s and early 1960s show a clear-eyed awareness of what was happening and why. What they did not have was a solution within the existing structure of the institution. There was one strategic option that the railroad's leadership returned to repeatedly, across 2 decades of internal deliberation. It was not a solution, exactly, but it was the only option that seemed to offer a path forward. If the Pennsylvania Railroad could not fix its problems from within, perhaps it could combine with another railroad facing the same pressures, eliminate the duplicated infrastructure between the two systems, and create an entity large enough to generate the efficiencies that neither could achieve alone. The logical partner was the New York Central. The New York Central ran parallel to the Pennsylvania Railroad across most of its territory. The two roads shared the same origins. Both had been built to move freight between the eastern seaboard and the interior, and they shared the same problems: declining freight revenue, bleeding passenger service, physical plant that demanded capital neither railroad could fully supply. The Central had its own legendary trains, the 20th Century Limited, its own engineering achievements, its own corporate culture. Merging the two would be operationally complex. The regulatory approval process would be lengthy and contentious, but the alternative for both roads seemed to be slow, isolated decline. Two railroads, facing the same structural pressures from the same competitive forces, had arrived at the same conclusion by different paths. The merger they were contemplating would be the largest in American history. What neither road's leadership had fully reckoned with was the possibility that combining two troubled institutions might not produce one healthy one. It might simply produce one very large troubled institution. The Interstate Commerce Commission approved the Penn Central merger in January of 1968 after 7 years of regulatory proceedings. The approval came with conditions. The merged railroad was required to absorb several smaller, weaker lines, including the New Haven Railroad, which was already in bankruptcy. Rather than beginning its existence as a streamlined, rationalized system, the Penn Central started life burdened with obligations it had not sought and could not afford. The operational integration of the two railroads was handled catastrophically. The Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central had spent a century developing incompatible operational systems, incompatible communications protocols, and, crucially, incompatible computer systems. The freight car tracking system of the PRR and the tracking system of the NYC were not designed to communicate with each other. When the merger was completed, the combined railroad lost the ability to locate thousands of its freight cars. Cars sat in yards for days waiting for routing information that the system could not provide. Shippers who had arranged their production schedules around the railroad's promised transit times found their shipments delayed, rerouted, or simply lost in a yard somewhere between Pittsburgh and Buffalo. The management breakdown went beyond systems. The Penn Central's two top executives, Stuart Saunders, who came from the PRR, and Alfred Perlman, who came from the NYC, reportedly stopped speaking to each other within months of the merger closing. Decisions that required coordination between the two men sometimes went unmade for weeks. A railroad that needed to function as a single organism was being run by a leadership team that had fractured. The revenue loss from this operational chaos was immediate and severe. Shippers who had no alternative to rail freight were furious. Shippers who had alternatives, and by 1968, with the interstate highway system substantially complete, most shippers did, began moving their business to trucks. The freight revenue that the Penn Central desperately needed to service its debt and fund its maintenance backlog evaporated precisely when it was most critical. The financial structure of the merged company was equally fragile. The Pennsylvania Railroad had entered the merger with a weakened balance sheet. The New York Central had entered with its own accumulated deficits. The combined entity carried an enormous debt load against a revenue base that was declining from day one. The management team, drawn from both predecessor companies, politically divided and struggling to master an operational crisis on top of a financial one, could not stabilize the situation. 19 months after the merger closed, Penn Central was insolvent. On June 21, 1970, the Penn Central Transportation Company filed for protection under the federal bankruptcy laws. The filing listed liabilities of more than $3 billion. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. The proximate causes were clear: operational chaos, a crushing debt load, declining traffic, management that was overwhelmed by problems too numerous and too large to solve simultaneously. But the deeper causes had been building for 2 decades. The highway system had taken the freight. The airline industry had taken the passengers. The physical plant had deteriorated beyond the point where current revenues could sustain its maintenance. The merger had been attempted as a solution to problems that no merger, under those conditions, could have solved. The empire that had been a century in the making had lasted less than 2 years in its final form. What the bankruptcy left behind was not an absence. It was an enormous, complex, physically deteriorating railroad system that still moved millions of tons of freight and tens of millions of passengers every year, and that the American economy could not simply do without. The Penn Central bankruptcy created an immediate practical crisis. The railroad could not be simply shut down. Too much freight moved over its lines. Too many people commuted on its electrified suburban services. The bankruptcy court kept the railroad operating while the legal and financial proceedings worked their way through the system. What the court could not do was fund the maintenance that years of deferred upkeep had left unresolved. Through the early 1970s, Penn Central operated on a steadily deteriorating physical plant. Slow orders multiplied across the system. Freight cars went unrepaired. Locomotives broke down and waited for parts. The Northeast Corridor, the electrified main line from Washington to Boston, the densest passenger rail corridor in the United States, was in such poor physical condition by 1973 that trains could not safely operate at the speeds the line had been built for. A line designed for a 100-mile-per-hour operation was running trains at 40. The political response to the Penn Central collapse was shaped by a recognition that had been building in Washington for years. American railroad passenger service could not survive in its existing form without structural public support. The railroad industry had spent the post-war decades making this argument in boardrooms and before regulatory agencies, and Washington had spent the same period declining to accept it. The Penn Central bankruptcy made the argument impossible to ignore. Congress had already created Amtrak, the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, in 1971, 1 year after the Penn Central filing. Amtrak assumed operational responsibility for the intercity passenger trains that the surviving railroads no longer wanted to run. The Pennsylvania Railroad's passenger trains, the Broadway Limited, the Keystone, the Pennsylvanian, became Amtrak trains. The red, white, and blue logo of the new national system replaced the PRR's distinctive Keystone emblem on the side of locomotives and passenger cars. The freight system required a different solution. In 1973, Congress passed the Regional Rail Reorganization Act, the legislation that created Conrail, the Consolidated Rail Corporation. 3 years later, the Railroad Revitalization and Regulatory Reform Act provided the additional funding and regulatory relief Conrail needed to begin rebuilding the system in earnest. Conrail absorbed the Penn Central and 6 other bankrupt northeastern railroads. It began the work of rationalizing the physical plant, abandoning unprofitable lines, repairing the track on the most important corridors, and reducing the operating costs that had overwhelmed the predecessor companies. The federal government invested more than $7 billion in Conrail over the first decade of its existence. The Northeast Corridor, the electrified main line, was separated from Conrail and transferred to Amtrak, which undertook a massive rehabilitation program through the late 1970s and 1980s. The catenary system that Alexander Cassatt had envisioned, that the Pennsylvania Railroad had built across more than 600 miles of its main line, was rebuilt, upgraded, and extended. The GG1 electric locomotives that had been the pride of the PRR fleet were eventually retired, replaced by newer electric equipment. But the fundamental infrastructure, the tunnels under the Hudson, the overhead wire, the tracks through Penn Station, remained, as it remains today. The human cost of the railroad's decline was concentrated in specific places, in ways that took decades to fully manifest. Altoona, Pennsylvania, the city the railroad had built, lost more than half its railroad employment between 1955 and 1985. The Altoona shops, which had once employed 17,000 people in a single complex, were reduced to a fraction of that workforce as Conrail rationalized its maintenance operations. The population of Altoona declined steadily from its post-war peak. The downtown commercial district contracted, schools closed, the physical fabric of a city that had been built around a single employer began to show the strain of that employer's diminishment. The pattern repeated across the railroad towns of the Pennsylvania Main Line: Harrisburg, Connellsville, McKeesport, Pitcairn. Communities whose commercial and social lives had been organized around the railroad's presence found themselves navigating a transition for which they had little preparation and limited institutional support. The railroad brotherhoods, the unions that had represented PRR workers for generations, spent the 1970s and 80s in a rearguard action, fighting to protect the wages and work rules of a workforce that was steadily shrinking. The labor agreements that had been negotiated in the decades of the railroad's strength became, in the period of its weakness, one of the operational costs that Conrail struggled most to reduce. The political difficulty of modifying those agreements delayed the cost restructuring that Conrail needed to achieve financial stability. The people who had spent careers on the Pennsylvania Railroad, the machinists and boilermakers and locomotive engineers and conductors and dispatchers and clerks, were not simply economic casualties. They were the carriers of an institutional knowledge that had been built up over generations. How to move a loaded freight train through a mountain pass in a January ice storm. How to manage the timing of 100 freight cars through a hump yard without losing your schedule. How to keep a locomotive running 3,000 miles from the nearest fully equipped repair shop. That knowledge did not transfer easily to other industries. And for many of the men who possessed it, there were no other industries waiting to receive it. The trucks and airlines that displaced the Pennsylvania Railroad from its traditional markets did not simply absorb the business the railroad had carried. They changed the structure of that business in ways that reshaped the American economy. The interstate highway system made it economically feasible for manufacturers to locate production facilities without regard for proximity to railroad yards. A factory that would once have needed a rail siding to ship its product could now load its goods onto a truck and have them delivered anywhere within a day's drive. The geography of American manufacturing, which had been shaped for a century by the locations of rail lines and rail terminals, began to shift. Industries that had clustered in the industrial cities of the Northeast and Midwest, because those cities offered rail access, began to disperse. The dispersal benefited the highway system. It weakened the concentrated freight flows that had made the Pennsylvania Railroad's dense urban network so productive. The airline industry, meanwhile, was carrying not just passengers, but the cultural associations that had once belonged to the great trains, the luxury of the Broadway Limited, the convenience of a departure from Midtown Manhattan, the sociable atmosphere of a dining car at dinner somewhere over the mountains. All of that passed, imperfectly, to the airplane. The romance of railroad travel persisted in popular memory long after the trains themselves had been reduced to infrequent, often late services operated by a cash-strapped national corporation. The freight business that Conrail eventually made profitable again was a different freight business than the one the Pennsylvania Railroad had built. Unit trains of coal, grain, and chemicals, long trains of identical cars carrying a single commodity from origin to destination without intermediate classification, replaced the mixed manifest freights that had once been the backbone of the system. Intermodal traffic, containers and trailers moving on flat cars, grew steadily. The labor-intensive less-than-carload business, the boxcar freight that had once supported thousands of small-town freight stations and armies of clerks and handlers, was gone almost entirely, absorbed by trucking, and by the parcel carriers that trucks had made possible. Conrail was privatized in 1987, sold to shareholders in what was at the time the largest initial public offering in American history. The federal government recovered most of its investment. In 1999, Conrail was divided between two surviving major eastern railroads, CSX Transportation and Norfolk Southern. The physical assets of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the main line, the tunnels, the bridges, the yards, were absorbed into those systems. Norfolk Southern operates trains today over the same horseshoe curve that the Pennsylvania Railroad built in 1854. No single event in the Pennsylvania Railroad's decline left a more lasting mark on American culture Then the demolition of Pennsylvania Station. The station had been completed in 1910. By 1958, the railroad was discussing ways to generate revenue from the site. The real estate market in Midtown Manhattan had transformed the land beneath the station into one of the most valuable properties on earth. The railroad's leadership, struggling with the same financial pressures that would eventually drive it into the Penn Central merger, made the decision to demolish the above-ground structure of the station and replace it with a new underground facility combined with a sports and entertainment arena above. The new Penn Station would be a revenue-generating commercial property. The old Penn Station would be rubble. Demolition began in 1963. The architectural community reacted with an anguish that surprised even those who might have anticipated opposition. Ada Louise Huxtable, the architecture critic of the New York Times, wrote with fury about the destruction of a building that had taken the craft of a civilization to produce and could not be replaced by any amount of money. Protesters picketed the construction site. A generation of New Yorkers watched the pink granite columns and the great vaulted glass ceiling of the concourse come down piece by piece. The rubble was hauled to the Secaucus Meadowlands and dumped. The granite columns, the carved stone eagles, the iron tracery buried in the mud of the New Jersey marshes. Decades later, when the site was excavated, fragments of the old station were still there. The demolition of Penn Station was the catalyst for the modern historic preservation movement in the United States. New York City passed its Landmarks Preservation Law in 1965, 2 years after demolition began, specifically to prevent the destruction of Grand Central Terminal, which faced a similar threat. The law has since protected hundreds of historic structures. The Federal Historic Preservation Act followed in 1966, establishing a national framework for identifying and protecting historic properties. Penn Station was gone. What its destruction produced, the legal and political infrastructure for protecting the built heritage of American cities, outlasted the railroad that destroyed it. We return at the end to the question posed at the beginning. How did the Pennsylvania Railroad become the largest corporation in the United States? And how did an empire built over a century of steel and steam come undone in a single catastrophic decade? The answer, as it usually is in these histories, is that no single cause was sufficient. The highway system took the freight, gradually, and then decisively. The airline industry took the passengers, gradually, and then decisively. The physical plant aged faster than the declining revenues could maintain it. The labor agreements made cost reduction difficult. The regulatory framework made operational flexibility limited. The Penn Central merger, which might have been an intelligent response to these pressures under better conditions, was attempted under the worst possible conditions. 2 weakened railroads, incompatible systems, an operational crisis that overwhelmed the management team from the first week. But there's a deeper answer, one that extends beyond the specifics of railroad economics. The Pennsylvania Railroad was built to solve a particular set of problems: how to move large quantities of freight and large numbers of people over long distances across difficult terrain in an era when nothing else could do it as well. For 100 years, nothing could. The railroad was not just the best available option, it was, for most of that century, the only available option at the required scale. The wealth it generated, the industrial geography it created, the cities it built, and the communities it sustained, all of this rested on that fundamental technical reality. When that reality changed, when the highways and the airways offered genuine alternatives for freight and passengers, the entire economic structure that the Pennsylvania Railroad had built began to decompress. The institution survived, in changed form, under different ownership, operating different services over much of the same physical infrastructure. The tracks through the Horseshoe Curve still carry freight trains today, but the Pennsylvania Railroad, the institution, the culture, the empire, ended with the 1960s. It ended because the century that had made it necessary had ended first.